Thanks so much, Curt. Um, so much there to be thinking about. I've been taking notes and jotting down questions. And what I'm wondering if we can do in this kind of Q&A time is I'd like to try to relate some of the psychological observations that you've made to some theological formulations. Because one of the things I'm very interested in with this conference, we're talking about science, we're talking about spiritual formation, we're talking about integrating our disciplines. And so maybe we can start this way. I've mentioned John Wesley a few times already. Anyone who knows me well, he comes up. He's helpful in a lot of ways. So just be prepared for that. So Wesley had a category that he called infirmities. And for Wesley, infirmities were inward or outward imperfections of a non-moral nature, right? So imagine a disability, right? Perhaps someone who has a Down syndrome, right? We would call that an imperfection, but it's not in any sense ethical or moral or related in any way like that. And there are a range of these. And he was very careful. Like, he wouldn't tolerate someone saying drunkenness is my infirmity. He's like, no, that doesn't cut it. We're not going to go there. So what I'm thinking about, and so for Wesley, holiness, sanctification was not necessarily freedom from infirmity, right? Because holiness is about ethics and morality. And there's this whole category of things, right? And so I'm wondering if shame can be understood in that category of non-moral imperfections. I'm wondering if trauma, right? So if I carry wounds that are someone else because of something someone else has done to me, does that fit into this theological category related to holiness, sanctification, spiritual formation in terms of infirmity? Do we need to recover this notion of non-moral imperfections? And then in relation to condemnation, I'm throwing about 8 questions here at one time. But in relation to condemnation, like, if we think about shame and condemnation in a related way, but if we can transfer shame into this idea of infirmities, which are not things for which we are condemned, I wonder if that helps us kind of create some space for healing. If that makes sense. If it doesn't, I can try to re-articulate it.
Yeah.
But let me throw that out there. There's a lot going on.
Maybe. Yeah, well, it's a great question, and I'm so let me see if I know if this will be helpful. I try to get it. I think I'm not getting explicitly to this because I wasn't aware of Wesley's categorization of that, which is like a lovely way, I think, to talk about it. But the story in John 9, the Gospel of John, chapter 9, really for me feels. It's been really helpful for me. John 9 is a story that opens with Jesus and the disciples coming upon a man blind from birth. And in some respects, I wonder if that might not meet criteria for what Wesley might call an infirmity.
I think so, yeah.
He's blind. But that blindness, that condition, that infirmity, in the human experience of life, never just sits there as some kind of neutral thing. It is immediately something to which everybody is responding. I'm responding to this in some way. So the blind guy is sitting by the side of the road. And so there's all these implications, right? For blindness, actually, it's an infirmity, but it was a thing that had him already cast out as being less than. Because the question, of course, the disciples do not immediately come to Jesus and say, oh my gosh, Jesus, it's an opportunity to heal a guy. What a great marketing opportunity. Well, like, you heal him, we'll put it on, we'll put it on Instagram. Like, it'll be awesome. They don't see this infirmity in light of the possibility of healing. They see that the infirmity is immediately relationally translated as a function of shame. Who sinned? This man or his parents, such that he was born blind? And so, again, there is this particular condition, but the condition immediately is something about which we make meaning. And we are doing this all the time. We can't not do it. We are meaning-making people. And so the question then becomes, okay, I'm blind, and what are we then going to do about it? And then Jesus says this most remarkable thing. He says, like, this man, nor his parents sinned, but this man was born blind such that the works of God might be revealed in him. And I'm thinking, like, holy crap, like, what the heck does that even mean? If I'm the disciples, like, I've got no category for what he's talking about. All I know is this is a blind dude, and that's bad news, because it means somewhere his parents were cursed or his grandparents were cursed. Like, shame is in the room. And then, there's no like signed, like, medical, whatever. Jesus he doesn't ask him. He just puts mud on his face. And the man is healed, and then all hell breaks loose. You would think that his family, his neighbors, his community would want to have a party. But no. At the end of the day, it's not even about him. It's about Jesus. And Jesus now becomes the subject, the problem, but the man becomes the tool that the leaders are going to use to get at him. And the man is like, I didn't sign up for this. I didn't ask to be healed. I don't even know who you're talking about. I just know that some dude came. I was blind. Now I can see. You go check it out. Here's my point. I think that we are, my sense is, I'll just speak for myself. My sense is that I am forever in this process of having to, I'm 58 and I can't do what I could do when I was 38. And it really kind of like ticks me off sometimes. And so I have an infirmity. I have infirmities in certain, but I also have infirmities in other ways, inner ways that aren't just physical. And the question is not just what am I going to do about this static thing that I call my blindness. The blindness becomes an opportunity for others around me to actually become avenues of healing. The problem in John 9 was not that the guy was blind, it was that the community was.
Wow. That's good.
And this whole thing, like, this is like the progression of the chapter, like, leads to this, like, at the end of the day, like, the man is saved worshiping Jesus, and you've got a whole community that is like in the dark. And so I don't know what, I don't know what Wesley says about this, but like what I see is like when we name these infirmities, how do we see them? I name it as infirmity. It's non-moral, and I get that, but it is also now an opportunity for the work of God to be seen and to emerge in me in ways that my imagination often is too truncated because of my own shame. One of the things we didn't talk about that I want to say, that one of the most powerful things that shame does is that it shears off our capacity to imagine God being at work. Shears off our capacity to create, to imagine beauty. Shears off the disciples' ability to see that the man born blind was God waiting to burst into the town. They couldn't see that. And so, people will sometimes ask me this same thing when it comes to particular psychiatric disorders that people experience that often feel intractable. People with schizophrenia, people with significant bipolar disorder, a whole range of conditions in which the patient themselves may or may not even feel like they're, they may not think they have a problem. And so then I'll ask the family or whoever, like, well, who's more troubled about this, you or your son or your daughter? Well, we are. I'm like, yeah. Because the problem here may not just be that your son has a condition. The problem may be, what is it about your own response to this condition? What is God trying to do within you as the community in response to this person who has the condition? So I think I see it as that when these things happen in us as individuals, it becomes opportunity for us to ask the bigger question, how is God using this to draw all of us as a community toward a place of hope and healing?
Yeah, I think that's helpful. So just continuing on that hope and healing theme then, and again, looking at psychology in relation to theology. So let's talk about the doctrine of justification by faith. Justification by faith, heavy in the Reformation, for good, solid for Protestants, typically framed in terms of forgiveness of sin, right? So the emphasis is on culpability. I stand condemned, and I can move out of condemnation because God has accepted Christ in my place, or something like that, right? So, but at the same time, justification isn't simply about forgiveness; it's also about acceptance by God. And so I think, help us think through, maybe connect some of these dots in terms of how the concept of our acceptance by God, who accepts us in Christ, helps us work through our shame and healing through that shame, right? If God accepts me, I need to accept myself. And
right. Well, Matt, this is why I just need to come to Montgomery, and then you and I go someplace for 3 days and like have really good food and really good beverages, and like you can do it. You can straighten me out, because so here's one thing that when these things, one thing that I try to keep in mind, and that is that and I'm not a theologian, so I say this, it's like, well, I say this with humility, which doesn't sound very humble. My sense is that theology emerges. I mean, we said earlier, like the brain operates bottom to top and right to left. First we sense, and then we make sense of what we sense. And so we, as the people of God, have had particular embodied experiences. I experienced something. Abraham experienced this something that was happening, where the fear, where God, the Yahweh, was, even though not known to him as such, was coming for him. He experienced something. I'm like, if I'm Sarah, I'm like, dude, like, what have you been smoking? We're going to Palestine. We have an experience, and then we want to make sense of the experience. We first sense, and then we make sense of what we sense. And we're always in the process of doing this. And then the thing that we make sense of, that making sense process itself, becomes part of what we sense. It also then shapes. And so the right and the left brain are in this Beethoven's nice symphonic way of being integrated, one with the other, shaping. So when we talk about something like justification by faith, before it is a principle in abstraction, I would guess that St. Paul and others who wrote about this or think about this, and the church fathers and the Reformation and so forth, they've had some kind of experience in which what's taking place in the world is made sense by using this kind of language and metaphor as a way to describe it and to get our hands around it. And so we use words to talk about things like forgiveness and talk about things like acceptance and so forth and so on. And I would say that in Jesus, my sense of this, in Jesus shows up, and he says, the first words recorded in the synoptics are repent, right? In his public ministry. The first words recorded in the Gospel of John are not that. They're, what do you want? What do you want? And it's not an either or, right? This is a guy who's coming saying, like, prepare the way of the Lord, because like, I'm here, like, get ready. And is also coming with great curiosity about who we are. Like, he's coming to meet us where we are. And I would say, if that guy was in the room and I lived through what Peter and the rest of them and Paul lived through, I think at some point I would be so overwhelmed by being loved by this guy and by this guy's life transforming what it was like for me to be loved, that I could, and then I look at my life and I'm like, as Peter said, go away from me. And Peter was grieved in his heart because Jesus is not going to stop, but he's coming for any, stone that's left still turned over about Peter's shame at that breakfast on the beach in John 21. This sense that justification is a thing that happens because I've been overwhelmed by a God who comes to me. And in that bright light, I see, like, oh my gosh, like, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do to deserve this, because it's so overwhelmingly, emotionally, physically, experientially evident that God is all of this and I'm not that. But I also recognize that like God takes me seriously enough that Jesus says, follow me. He doesn't come, with an army and say, you come with me, you're going to be, conscripted. There's a sense in which God is constantly behaving in a way that justifies me by virtue of his very behavior. And my faith, I'm justified by my faith, meaning like I'm going to respond to that. I'm going to have to trust that. And I may trust that early on. I tell people, like, for me, conversion is kind of like Jesus has found my old carcass of a broken down car out on the highway someplace, and conversion is like, I say, yes, you can take my car. He takes my car and brings it into his garage. And now I'm with all these other cars in God's garage family. And now he's going to work on my car, getting it ready for the new heaven and the new earth, in the process of like getting it ready with other cars. And there are times when he looks under the hood and I'm like, I don't want to look at that. But I have to remember, I'm in his garage. I have been justified because I would be like, yes, I'm receiving, being brought into his garage, being forgiven. I don't know if I'm answering this question very well or not. But I want us to know that, like, so for instance, forgiveness, like the notion that God forgives us, it is an act. It demonstrates this in Good Friday and resurrection. And the question is then, am I willing to receive it? I tell people routinely, our biggest problem is not that we don't love others well. If I don't love others well, it's because I can't give them what I don't have. My biggest problem as a human is the difficulty that I have actually receiving God's love. I don't receive it well. I may be justified. I might know that cognitively, but until I sense it in my chest, in my embodied state, to a question applied at the end of our first session, until I sense this, it's not ultimately real for me. Yeah. Which is why the church, one of the reasons why the church is such a big deal, to create a community in which people can, in embodied ways, see the eyes of Jesus, hear the voice of Jesus, feel the touch of Jesus' hand on their backs as we pray for them, as we don't leave the room, despite how much shame comes, despite the fact that they would like, go away from me, I can't tolerate this. I'll stop.
No, that's good. I think it's helpful. And here's a way to maybe frame it a little bit in the context of your discussion already. So Sam asks, would be interested in hearing Dr. Thompson discuss shame as it relates not only to the daughter of the man who left for Seattle, but as it relates to that father, the guy who left.
Right.
What should he be feeling? What's like, how does shame relate to what his behavior in that instance?
Right. Right. Well, this is, I mean, this is what the Bible would call idolatry.
Right.
Right. I mean, like in some respects, when Eve takes the fruit, right? Everything else in the garden is a gift. It's been given. They don't have to take. She takes the fruit. And I would suggest that there are a lot of multiple motivations going on there. And of course, like as I tell people, look, you have to be very careful not to over psychologize scripture. You have to be very careful not to like insert, your understanding of the psychology of Adam and Eve when like the text doesn't actually speak to that. At the same time, if we're not imagining it, then the Bible won't have much to say to me because it won't have much to say to my own mind's development. I would suggest that one of the things that's happening when she takes the fruit is she's not just, dealing with the information that the devil gave her, that the serpent gave her. She's dealing with her own felt sense in that moment of distress. That to take the fruit is a way for me to cope with what I'm now experiencing in light of this conversation that I've just had with this creature. Notice that he makes sure that the conversation is held in isolation. He doesn't say, hey, wait, tonight when God comes for his walk, I want to have a conversation with all four of us. No, it's held in isolation. And so that taking becomes a coping strategy for me. And the coping strategy, like all addictions, like all idolatry, becomes a way for me to disseminate, for me to distract, for me to actually turn my attention away from the distressing emotional state of shame. And this is then what I practice. And every time shame shows up, I just double down on my addiction. I double down on my idolatry. I double down on whatever that is. And so by the time the father of the 19-year-old is leaving for Seattle, he's been practicing for a long time using his idolatries, using his addictions, using his affair, using whatever, all that behavior is a way for him to cope with his own underlying story. In much the same way that Steve, though did beautiful work as a scientist, also put some of that energy into that work as a way to cope with his shame, which also meant, as we'll get to in the next section, what we really discovered was that part of what was, Steve's challenge was not just that his son died, but that in his son's death, Steve recognized that his science couldn't stop it. That for all the work that he'd done, for all that he believed in science to be able to save the universe, it couldn't keep his son from hanging himself. And that, of course, led Steve to the question of well, where the heck was I? Not only could my science not stop it, but why couldn't I stop it? What was wrong with me? Which, of course, as time went on, led to our talking more and more about his first 2 decades of life and recognizing that so much of his grief about his son was also wrapped up in his grief about the loss that he had within his own family of origin. Mm-hmm. And we can't separate that stuff out. We don't get any details on it, but if we were actually there, for that first couple and their first kids and so forth, Cain and Abel, it wouldn't take much for us to become aware that something's going on in that family, right? Goes on in every family. Why is it that the firstborn feels all this pressure? And now he's upset because his thing doesn't matter, right? His sacrifice isn't good enough for whatever reason. We're not told. And God says that's not the point. Again, the point is, if you feel what you feel, shame is lurking at your door and its desire is for you. Its desire to devour. The question is, what will you do with this? At which point, as we'll talk about in the next time, the answer to that, God, what will we do with this? Well, we're going to do our own thing. And God, throughout the course of history, has been saying no, I want your thing to be me. I want to be your thing. I want to be your husband, your wife. I want to be your mother, your father. I want to be to the people of Israel. I will covenant with you. Now, I'm going to take the fruit and do it my way. Yeah. Because not just my own personal shame, but how shame is generationally passed along to the point where this is the thing with epigenetics. I carry with me stuff, I'm sure, not just from my parents, but from my grandparents that I know that I carry, and probably from my great-grandparents, given the stories that I've heard. And I'm now the point of the spear of lots of generational inertia that's pushing behind that. So that when I have to deal with my stuff, I'm not just dealing with my stuff. And this is why community plays such an important role. Yeah. As we'll get to in the next section.
So on the, let me, there's a question here on holiness that I wanted to bring up from Frank. And I'm just going to read it. I've got some thoughts on it. I'll let you go first, and then maybe if there's space.
Dude, if you got thoughts, I want to hear them before I talk.
So he says,
I was born at night, but not last night.
Well, maybe. Well, let me read it and we'll see what happens.
Okay.
He says, if holiness is all about diminishing the self or ego so that Christ's character may increase, then how can shame be mitigated to allow that process to be fulfilled, right? So how do we keep shame from hindering the diminishment of the self? And just briefly, my thought is, I would want to say in the Wesleyan tradition, we talk a lot about holiness as self-denial. Wesley, and there's some really helpful sources, some Wesleyan theologians have written some books on this, that holiness is not simply the negation of something, it's the fulfillment of perfect love.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not just decreasing the self. And
right.
I think C.S. Lewis made some comments as well, I want to say, where we've kind of made the mistake of defining Christian virtue in negatively and not positively.
Right.
So we've kind of said, you know, Christian virtue is about denying yourself, take up your cross, deny yourself, and follow me. And we've forgotten to say that Christian virtue is about the fullness of faith, hope, and love, right? These virtues.
Right.
And so that's not to denigrate self-denial, of course, right? But self-denial doesn't mean I go away. It means that Christ is able to bring me to fullness, right? And then that connects with our flourishing talks. It connects with, you know, what it means to become fully human. So I would want to say holiness is about self-denial, but in Christ coming to fullness in us, that brings us to our true selves.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're living in that, then shame is not going to be the defining salient aspect of our psychology. There's a theological approach. You give us a
Well, I would say that, you know, when I hear in the English, when Jesus says, he who would follow after me must deny himself, pick up his cross and follow me. You know, it's easy for us to hear that word self, deny myself. And I just think it like comprehensively. Right. And to deny, like to your point, often feels like, you know, I'm just going to self-diminishment. Right. But the way I experience this in the clinic with patients would go something like this. You know, it's kind of like the rich young ruler, especially in Mark, in Mark's gospel, in Mark's version of it, in Mark 12. You know, it's the only gospel that says this, that when, you know, they get through the first part of their conversation, and before Jesus, you know, says to him what he says, he says, the text reads, and Jesus looked at him and loved him and said, there's one thing you lack. Go and sell all that you have, give to the poor, and come and follow me. And I thought to myself, oh, wow. He missed the look of love. He missed it. And I wondered to myself, is Jesus, when he says, go sell what you have, is the problem his wealth? I'm not so sure. Or rather, is the problem that his wealth represents a guy who only knew one way to live, and that was, I've got to work to get my Father to love me. I mean, his question to Jesus is, what must I do to inherit the kingdom of God? What must I do? And Jesus' response is, well, you know, have you done what these things? Yes, all of them. There's one thing you lack. And the thing you lack is this penchant for believing that you have to work to earn my love. And your insistence on your independent work to make yourself good enough by earning all your money, you're going to have to give that up. It's not about your wealth per se. It's this posture of, I have to work in order for dad to love me. And that's what I have to give up. And that may require me to give up my wealth, because my wealth is the material function of my addiction. And so when I hear deny yourself, I think about, there are huge parts of myself that are self-shaming. There are huge parts of myself that tell myself, I won't be okay if I don't have this and this and this in my life. And like, that's all about shame being at work, which leads to my addiction, my idolatry, whatever we want to call that. And that is the self, that is the part of me that is saying to me all day, every day, you're not enough, you're not enough. This is the devil in the details. This is the serpent coming to me and saying, like, your Father doesn't really want you enjoying him with his kingdom, because if he did, he'd give you what you want. It's that's the part of the self that is shaming, that needs to be denied. Again, back to John's gospel, Jesus' first words were, what do you want? What do you really want? You know, one of the most in this next book that's coming in September, we talk an awful lot about this question of, what do you want? And how, for many of us, we so pay attention to, what do I have to deny? What do I have to deny? That I don't actually ask the question, what do I want? For a lot of reasons. I'm afraid to, because if I'm a Christian, I'm not even supposed to like be thinking about what I want. And then if I answer that question, I want to make sure that I answer it correctly, so that like when God asks me, what do you want? That I want to, could you please tell me what the right answer is, so that I'm not in trouble when I tell you that what I want is not what I'm supposed to want? But this is where it gets back to this question that you were asking about before, about justification by faith. Like, I can't just know that as an abstraction. I have to feel that in my chest. I have to know it in my body in such a way that when that God says to me, when that Jesus says to me, what do you want? I'm going to say, like, dude, whatever you want, whatever you want, because I've never been loved like this. I'll go anywhere you want me to go. Right? This is the blind man at the end of John 9. I'll go. I fall and worship you. And so I would say, denying myself is really responding to Jesus saying, Curt, I want you to put away the parts of yourself that are always so hard on you, and that lead to addiction, and that keep you from me, and that keep you from joy, and that keep you from beauty, and that keep you from seeing that, like, you are loved. That's the part that I want you to put away. And to pick up your cross, I didn't really finish this, but in the clinic, to pick up the cross is to actually go and face the stuff, the cross of my shame, the stuff where all these things about my life that I've covered over with my addiction. I'm going to deny the addiction, that part of myself, and I'm going to pick up the cross of looking at the part of me that I don't like, the part of me that I wish you don't ever get to see. But I'm going to look at it in Jesus' presence, and he's going to say, here's what we're going to do with this. We're going to transform this very thing that you hate the most into the most beautiful part of your life. And you're like, I don't get that. And he says, like, yep, that's why that's my job. Mm-hmm. And I just want you to hang out with me long enough to see it happen.
That's tremendous. It's helpful for me to kind of, because theologically and pastorally, I come at this from one approach. It's tremendously helpful for me to kind of have a more well-rounded approach. There's one more kind of set of dots I want to see if we can connect, and then we'll take a short break and go to our third session. So in Romans, sin is talked about in different ways. At times, sin is a subject or a power that exercises dominion and enslaves or makes us captive. Mm-hmm. At other times, sin is a practice in which we are complicit, right? So at times, sin is an enslaving power that makes us captive. At other times, sin is a practice with which we are complicit. And when I read kind of interpersonal neurobiology and look at kind of the science of formation and holiness and growth and sin and, like addiction to certain sins with which we are complicit, whatever they may be, drugs, alcohol, other things, right, we're complicit, right? But there's a force acting on us as well, mm-hmm. in our biology. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering if there's an analogy for us in terms of the way the Bible talks about sin at these different levels. Mm-hmm. And so, and maybe this will help us segue into our focus on wholeness. But if I'm submitting myself in complicit to whatever the sin may be, and that creates space for it to have me in captivity, mm-hmm. and that's experienced physiologically. Mm-hmm. Neurons mm-hmm. that fire together, wire together, right? Ones, right. Then is there a strategy for moving towards wholeness and healing? And maybe you want to say that's what the next talk is about, but do you see the analogy that I'm getting at there?
Yeah, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're talking about, if I'm understanding this correctly, you're talking about there is this notion in which I actually do things that are sinful. I commit particular acts that are what I would call, in the language of interpersonal neurobiology, I commit acts that are disintegrating to myself and to other people. They lead away from wholeness. They lead away from healthy relationship. But there's also the sense in which I don't just commit things, but there is a felt sense of something bigger than me that's within me and even between me and you, like that I don't know, sometimes feels like it's a force that's acting on me. I mean, it feels like this, right? So for instance, if I'm upset about something and my wife is calm and collected and is able to say, well, tell me more about that. Like, her capacity to do that, be empathic, whatever, like it enables me very quickly to recalibrate, right? Because she's just really, really, over 36 years, 4 years, like that's, who we are. It's great. But if I have a thing that is bugging me and it may actually be about her, and she has a thing and she kind of has a dog in that fight, before you know it, the conflict between us feels much bigger than the sum of its parts. And it almost feels like a force that it's hard for us to get over. There's something almost outside of us that's kind of course, that I'm part of and contributing to, but feels like this thing I can't get my hands on, if that makes sense. And I think about I think about 2 or 3 things. The first thing I would say is that evil, by its very nature, I think is mysterious. I think, that one of the beautiful things about the Bible in the way that it talks about sin is that it doesn't just neatly compact it into these kind of like silos and say, well, here's what it is. Sin is just simply this matter of like things that you do. No, it actually reflects what the human experience is. That yes, they are things that I do, but yes, it's also this force, this thing that seems to be mysterious that I can't get my hands around, that seems other than me. But that I would also say, when you think about interpersonal neurobiology, when you think, all you got to think about is like the mentality of large crowds of people. When you get crowds of people together that are like a mob scene, like a mob mentality, like things start to blow up in ways that you can't stop it. It's bigger than the sum of its parts. It's not just 6 people or 100 people. It feels much bigger than that. Some of that, I would have to say, I suspect has a little bit to do with the notion of quantum mechanics. We like to talk about the mind as a complex system. We like to talk about it in terms of quantum mechanics and not in terms of Newtonian physics. And why is that important? Because with Newtonian physics, it's kind of like, you have an input of 1, you get an output of 1. An input of 2, you get an output of 2, right? All these things, the force of gravity remains constant no matter where you are on the earth. As long as you don't start to talk about the speed of light, as long as you don't get into relativity, as long as you don't get down into the very, very micro portions of how the world operates, into quantum mechanics, then those kind of 1 for 1, 2 for 2 rules apply. But once you get into complex systems that are more likely to obey the laws of quantum mechanics, of which the mind is one, what you discover is that you can have an input of 1 and get an output of 5. Right? We can be talking, and you make an innocent comment, and the next thing you know, my voice has gone from 0 to 60 in a heartbeat, and you're like, what did I say? Small input, large output. More like nuclear reaction. And I want to suggest that when you then, and so this is how the mind tends to work. It takes all it takes is a small thing, right? We can, it's like the couple that I saw who, this example's in Anatomy of the Soul, where they have a fight in their kitchen after work one day, and after a point, like he gets in the car and takes off, and she's like, "Where are you going? Why did you leave?" And he eventually gets around to saying, well, because I didn't want to say something I'd regret. I know that you get upset about things. What he didn't say was that he was actually having a memory in that moment, because when he was 10 years old and his father decided to get sober but didn't get into recovery from his alcoholism, he would come home every night angry as all get out. And what that kid has as a relief from his father's anger was a bicycle. And he'd get on the bike and he'd take off. And when he turned 16, he'd get in his car and he'd take off to avoid his father's anger. And when anger shows up in the kitchen, all it takes is a little bit from his wife and he's out the door. Small input, large output. And he has no idea that what it's coming from is years and years of neuroplastic practice that primed him for this. And so in some respects, I see the sin thing in the large way that Paul talks about it as being some amalgam of the presence of evil as a real independent thing in the world in some way, shape, or form, the nature of which I don't pretend to understand at all, but I believe is there. Some amalgam of that and this way in which we, as intricately made complex system human minds, can, we reinforce this in such a way that all it takes is a small input to have exponential output for me. One of the things that we talk about with shame is that, like, you'd think that, why is it that sometimes such a minor event that creates shame for us creates such a huge response in us, right? You hurt your friend's feelings yesterday and you go back and you say, man, I'm really sorry I did that. I was short with you. I didn't mean to do that. And your friend says, no, that's okay. One day later, you're thinking about it and you're still feeling bad. And you say, well, I feel guilty. Like, well, no, that's actually not guilt. That's shame talking. That's a neural function of shame, because even in a minor thing where you can experience forgiveness in that sense, your friends are like, we're good. You can still have this thing hole up in you in memory because of how much you carry in the payload of your mind, the payload of your brain. And in that sense, I think, Matt, man, evil just has this wide field where it can make its playground. And as we'll talk about when what's coming, the beauty of community gives us the opportunity to push against that, not me on my own having to face my own shame, but we together will face mine. We together will face yours. We together will do the work of the body of Jesus. And so, to your point that we were talking about earlier about about Paul's resurrection being about a social structure, like, dude, that's amazing, because of how it helps us imagine that in order for me to combat what is in me, I need an army. We all do.
There's a couple more, one or two more questions kind of that maybe will help us out a little bit. What's the difference, this is from Sam, what's the difference between shame and guilt?
It's a common question. And so I think it's a great question. The first thing I will say is that the first way it's different is developmentally. Shame, 15 to 18 months of life of age, we can begin to experience the phenomenon that we call that in terms of what's happening in the mind, in terms of what our behavioral responses are to that. The thing that we call guilt doesn't really begin to be something we perceive until we're somewhere around the ages of 4 to 6 years of age. Why is that? Many people would suggest that it has a lot to do with brain development, because the thing that we feel guilt when I feel it that is different than shame, guilt is a sense that I do something and my mind is developed enough that I can separate myself from what I've done. Moreover, and I have to have a mind that is developed enough to be able to do that. Like 2-year-olds can't do that. My mind, moreover, recognizes that what I have done has hurt somebody else with whom I have a relationship. So there's me, there's another person, and there's this thing. And my mind has to be advanced enough to recognize the separateness of all three of those things. When I'm younger, my mind isn't able to separate that stuff, and all I sense is myself. Here we say that guilt then is the thing that I have that where I've done something bad. Shame is I am bad. But here's the other important thing that's different about these two. A lot of research has been done on guilt, in college students and adults. And what's really interesting is that if you find yourself having committed an act or have done something that creates a rift between you and someone with whom you have a close relational connection, you've hurt their feelings, you've done whatever. The guilt that you experience typically tends to lead you to immediately, your first action is you want to go to them. You want to move toward them in order to clear this up. You want to move toward them to heal this. You want to move toward them to say, I'm so sorry. Will you please forgive me? You move toward the person because the guilt has this promise of reconciliation, that because the other person is involved, they can say, it's okay. It's okay, Curt, we're good. And you'd be like, oh, good. But the point is, I will go to you. I will come to you, Matt, and say, will you please forgive me? With shame, we don't do that. The nature of shame is such that to imagine myself being seen by you in the first place is so unpleasant, because I only imagine that I'm going to feel this distress even more strongly. I won't go to you. Hence, this is why I think the biblical narrative is such a big deal, and how so often sin and shame are coupled. And that is that we, in our shame, are not going to go to God on our own. God is going to have to come find us. We are going to have to go find people in their shame. I need somebody to come find me, because until I've had enough practice in a community to know that I can let them know and they won't leave the room, I'm just going to continue to drown in it. And this is why the gospel is such a big deal when it comes even to the neuroscience of shame, because the gospel says we serve a God who's coming for us. And in Jesus, he keeps coming and isn't ever going to stop.
Kurt, thanks so much. There's so much there. We could just keep going, but we probably need to give our folks a little bit of a respite for a moment. So when we rewrote the schedule last night, we promised to give you a little bit of space for a quick bite of lunch. So I think, and I know there are a few other questions in the chat box. If we have time to bring those back at the end, we'll do it. We put on the new schedule that the session 3 would start at 1 o'clock Central Standard Time. So take a quick break, grab yourself a bite to eat. Try not to let the Zoom fatigue wear you out too much. And we will come back and finish strong at 1 o'clock Central Time. That's 40 minutes from now. So grab a bite to eat and come back.